Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to wait for a couple of seconds for people to join us before we start talking about AI welders and the Rose Street Foundry. So, good morning. It's really nice to have you with us again. If you have been watching the series, then that's great. Thank you very much. If you haven't yet had a chance, please do look back over the previous films in this series. They can be found on our Facebook page, but also on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. So we've covered subjects from Jacobites and clearances and school records and all sorts of different things. So if you want to have a look back at that, please do. If you haven't watched any of them before, my name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. So my job basically involves anything at all that connects people to the records that we look after. And if you go back and see the subjects of the talk, you'll see that we're privileged to look after a really wide range of records and archives, and so lots of different ways that we can engage people with them and let them see what we look after. It's been really nice the last few weeks to see where people are from. So if you're able to tell us where you're watching from, that would be great. There's been people from all over the world watching, but I suspect this particular subject might have a bit of a more of a local following. It's such an important business to the Highlands that I think there'll be some local people watching this one. Um, so we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have one that I'm usually based in Inverness, the Highland Archive Centre. We have one up in Wick, Nucleus, which holds the Caithness records, one in Fort William, which holds the Lochaber records, and one in Portree, which holds the Skye and Lochalsh records. And across all of those, there are business collections. We have things as diverse as the John O'Groat Steam Laundry collection, the Brora Colliery records, British aluminium records, Firkin Lochleven smelter are held in Fort William, a wide range of solicitors' collections, which are always fantastic, full of a lot of information. Timber merchants' collections that include a letter from Thomas Telford, and a wide range of others. One particular one we'll be coming back to in a later week is the Duncan Macpherson collection, which is held in our Skye and Lochalsh archive. So we'll come back and talk about that in a few weeks. But this week we're going to focus on one particular business collection, and that is the collection of AI Welders or the Rose Street Foundry. Probably most people watching will be familiar with it by one of those names, but it has had several other names as well, and I'll touch on that as I go through. The company was based in Inverness, but grew from being a very small kind of agricultural foundry to becoming at the forefront of global innovation and technology. Had agents all across the world and a huge global impact. So we're going to talk about that. One thing I'd like to highlight just at the beginning, and I will come back to it again at the end, is that for those of you who are interested in Rose Street Foundry and the very iconic building that sits on Academy Street in Inverness, it would be worth you having a look at the Academy Street Regeneration Project, the Townscape Heritage Project. I've put a link to it in the comments. It is set up as a grant-giving project to promote the redevelopment of Academy Street, and one of the buildings that they've identified as a key building as part of that is the AI Welders Rose Street Foundry building. So there's more information on their website, but I'd encourage you to go and have a look at it if you're interested in the building. So, as I said, AI Welders Company has had several different names. So the company was founded in 1872, and it was called at the time the Northern Agricultural Implement Foundry Company. You can't even get a good abbreviation from that because I've tried. It was started as a general foundry making agricultural tools, fencing, small castings, things like that. So a traditional iron foundry. Although it was founded in 1872, it wasn't the first foundry on the site. So if you look at an earlier map, we have one in our collection from 1866 of the Rose Street and Academy Street area, and it shows that the Inverness foundry was already nearby. So there was a history of metalworking on the area, and of course, those of you who are familiar with Inverness will know of the Ironworks music venue, which is, of course, named after all the foundries on the site. Among the collections that we have, which is the Rose Street Foundry collection, we have all sorts of different things. We have plans, huge amounts of lovely photographs, which I'll come back to in a second, directors' minute books, all sorts of different things. And I'll touch on each of these as I go through. So I want to read you an extract from the first minute book. So it starts March 1872 with the appointment of Charles Fraser Mackintosh, who some of you will be a name you'll be familiar with, Peter Bailey and Donald Davidson, and they were tasked with preparing the preliminary formation of the company. They were tasked with finding a manager and also preparing a valuation for all the property that they were going to take over as this newly established company. Clooney Macpherson from Clooney Castle in Lagan was nominated as the chairman of the directors when it first opened. Those early minutes obviously give an insight into the company starting, but also into all sorts of different development aspects of the company. You can see recruitment through them. So there's very early references to trying to find different members of staff to fill positions. And an entry from the 22nd of October, 1872, talks about the recruiting for a foreman cartwright or master cartwright. They advertised in the Inverness Courier and the Inverness Advertiser, but they'd only received 4 applications for the job. And therefore they said, we're going to hold on for a moment, we're going to widen this to include the Banffshire Journal. And then it's interesting to see that in a later minute, that was obviously the right thing to do, because they appoint Gordon Donaldson from Huntly. So the guess is he probably saw it from that newspaper. So you just get an insight into how businesses at the time went around recruiting, advertising for positions, and so on. Another thing that can be seen from these early price lists is the sort of things that the foundry was making. So the minutes include price lists for small castings, parts of ploughs, agricultural tools, pulleys, the weights for sash windows, things like that. So all quite small and quite with a local market when it started. You can see in the minutes that they had a difficult couple of early years starting up a business, and also they were hit with huge material costs. So there was a rise in cost of materials and supplies. There was a rise in the cost of the labour market at the time, and so they were struggling to make a profit. But they did make a profit in their first year, and were suitably gratified with themselves. And so that's all recorded in the minutes to say that they had a successful start to the business. There are several different managers who came in and out in the early years, none very successful. The business kind of wavered a little bit under these different managers, which is interesting because it then went on to have very long-serving managers, long periods of time, and very, very successful. And the changing point for this was 1877. So that was when William Dingwall and Hugh Innes Fraser became the joint managers of the company. Within 4 months of being in post, they had substantially increased the output while somehow managing to reduce the wages bill and the costs. And so obviously that's all the shareholders, that's their ideal combination for a manager. And so Hugh Innes Fraser went on to be in charge of the company for 31 years. The 1881 census shows Hugh Innes Fraser living at 29 Rose Street. It can be quite interesting just to, when you pick a name from a business collection, to then have a look in the likes of census records, and those records that are more associated with family history sometimes, and just find out a little bit more. You get more glimpses of information there. So the 1881 census says that Hugh Innes Fraser was living at 29 Rose Street, so just in the middle of Inverness, around the corner from the foundry, with his wife and 6 children. And his occupation is listed as iron foundry manager, employing 60 men. So that gives us an insight into the scale of the business at that point. in 1881. It's also interesting to note that he went on to have 8 children. Several of them were engineers, and one went on to become a fairly early female doctor. So just an aside, but it's an interesting thing to note. They were obviously a family who were interested in pushing ahead with discoveries and innovations. This takes us into the 1890s. This was a huge period of change for the company. Lots of things happened. This is in the 1890s. They built some new workhouses. Workhouses. That's a whole different subject of talks. Built new warehouses, new workshops, and the showroom, which is the very famous building on Academy Street. The building on Academy Street was designed by Ross and Macbeth, who are very famous Highland architects, had been involved in a huge amount of notable projects, particularly Inverness Cathedral and various others. The building was an innovative building when it was constructed. Unusual for its time, it was steel framed rather than masonry framed, and it was one of the first steel frame buildings in the UK. This is the time that the famous mosaics date from on the Academy Street building, and the suppliers who were involved in this are extraordinary, really. They include Josiah Wedgwood and Sons, Minton Limited, Craven Dunhill. So some really, really big names who were involved in the creation of this building. If you're interested in the building itself, then I would really recommend going to have a wee look on the Inverness Creative Academy's Facebook page. They had a talk by Callum McLean just several weeks ago about the building and the development of that building. So if you're interested in the architecture of it, then do please go and have a look at that. So that was one thing that happened in the 1890s, was that the building changed. And we have some amazing photos from those kind of early days, and you'll have seen, I'm sure, the pictures that I put up on Facebook yesterday and our Twitter page. Amazing pictures of the moulding shop, the turning shop, and the external part of the building. They really are such an insight into how the building worked and what the atmosphere would have been like in there. 1895 was another big year for the company. So this was when they changed their name from Rose Street from the Northern Agricultural Foundry to Rose Street Foundry and Engineering Company. So this is to reflect the focus away from agricultural production and into wider iron founding. It's a huge boom time for the company as well. There was huge expansion of the railways at this time and various other projects. And so suddenly they found themselves very much in demand. A really interesting thing to note is that every single bridge on the Highland Railway was built by the Rose Street Foundry. Every footbridge. I think that's an extraordinary statistic. Every footbridge on the Highland Railway built by the Rose Street Foundry. And any of you who are watching in Inverness or are familiar with Inverness will know the Greg Street Bridge and other bridges that you can see still say produced in the Rose Street Foundry. So it's still a very important and familiar name to the Highlands. Moving on from the 1800s into the 1900s, 1907, the Rose Street Foundry Company acquired the lease of the Thornbush Slipway, which is just on the outskirts of Inverness, but it's down towards the waterfront. So they acquired that from the Inverness Harbour trustees with the aim that they could go more into marine engineering, enabling them to repair ships in Inverness, which would mean that ships wouldn't need to go to Aberdeen for repair. So that brought in, again, a huge new business for them. And you can see how they moved from agriculture to bridges to marine engineering, and that carries on right through the history of the company. I'll touch on that more in a second. It turned out to be a very, very important decision for them to go into marine engineering, which we'll see in about 10 years down the line. The other thing that happened around about that time was 1908 was the death of Hugh Innes-Fraser, who was that long-standing manager. His death meant the appointment of Sam Hunter Gordon as the chair and manager Rose Street Foundry. Now, the Hunter Gordons that's the family who are most frequently associated with the Rose Street Foundry and AI Welders. When Sam Hunter Gordon took over in 1908, that was the start of a 70-year family relationship with the business, which I'll come back a little bit, talk more about Sam Hunter Gordon in a second. So moving on into the First World War, obviously a time of huge change in so many aspects for the whole country, but from the Rose Street Foundry point of view, a time where wartime regulations came in, female workers were introduced, huge increase in trade. And it's interesting to note, as somebody had commented yesterday on one of the photos that I had put up on Facebook, what a huge number of staff there were. It's interesting to note that in World War I, for the period of World War I, there were around about 600 employees working for the Rose Street Foundry. So a really substantial employer in Inverness and the Highlands. First World War obviously broke out in 1914. Hostilities were declared on the 4th of August, late in the evening. But by the time that the hostilities were declared, already the Rose Street Foundry directors had a communication from the Admiralty, from the commander of the Cromarty Naval Base. And he'd already said, we will probably be requisitioning your buildings and your employees, and also anything that the Admiralty wants you to make has to be done urgently. Everything else must be dropped, and Admiralty work will have to be done quickly. Which is why I was saying it was so key that they had taken over the slipway and diversified into marine engineering just a few years previously. Sam Hunter Gordon was a particularly innovative person. He saw gaps in the market, and if he saw that there was a time that there was a potential for the business to fail, he would see what he could do differently. What could they do? What could they go into that would mean that people were still in jobs? And so this is an absolutely key time for this. Sam Hunter Gordon, alongside Donald Munro, who was the harbour master in Cromarty, the two of them together developed a boom defence system which would protect ships from submarines. So if you think of a submarine trying to breach its way into a naval base, the boom defences were nets that were dropped down from ships and from rafts to stop submarines getting through. And that was something that was developed and invented by Sam Hunter Gordon and Donald Munro. It was so successful that very, very quickly it was taken up by the Royal Navy. The Rose Street Foundry itself created the boom defences for the whole of the north of Scotland, including the famous ones at Scapa Flow in Orkney. They created just those ones, but the system they had invented went on and was spread around the world. As I say, as soon as the Royal Navy took it on board, it became very successful and was manufactured across the world to protect navies and harbours globally. Quite extraordinary when you think, this is a company that has started making the little pulleys for sash windows. By this point, the Thornbur Slipway employed about 120 women. Obviously, as men were pulled away to fight, there were women brought in to do some of those other jobs. And so they employed about 120 at that site. Because they were involved in the creation of the boom defences and also in creating mine sinkers, they were technically allowed to call themselves munitions workers. And so there's an absolutely wonderful photo of a group of women munitions workers based at the Rose Street Foundry in 1918. And as I said, both the foundry and the slipway were requisitioned during the First World War, and they both went on to, they both served throughout the 4 years of the war, making those mine sinkers and boom defences and various other things. The other thing they did, of course, was at the slipway was repair ships and kit ships out to be war ready. They also made saw benches for the Canadian Timber Corps, all sorts of different things. A really important company from the Highland point of view during the war. It's interesting to note that they really wanted to make weapons, so they kept writing to the government saying, please can we make weapons? We've got this foundry, we could do something. But the government said, no, what you're doing is important enough and valuable enough. Please don't stop what you're doing to create anything else. So it was a really prosperous time for the company, a time of a lot of innovation and a lot of publicity for the company. After World War I, as I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, there was a huge recession. All of that kind of energy and work kind of dissipated a wee bit. And so they found themselves in a recession. And again, Sam Hunter-Gordon looked around to see what could be done differently, where could he keep people in jobs. And so they became, amongst other things, they became the Highland distributor for Bean motor cars. My favourite thing is just that they were called Bean motor cars. But so that was the kind of downside after the First World War, was that there was this struggle for money and for business. 1921 was another kind of turning point for the company. This is when they took over AI manufacturing. AI manufacturing were a bankrupt company from Bradford in England, and they were a resistance welding company. And as they had gone bankrupt, they were bought over by the Rose Street Foundry, which is where we start to see why the AI comes into it. It's just interesting to note, as I've said several times, you can see this tiny company growing and growing and growing. And it's interesting to note that by about the 1920s, Rose Street Foundry had agents right across the world distributing products, advertising products. So they had representatives in Canada, Japan, Australia, South America, South Africa, really becoming a really global company. In 1931, they closed the traditional foundry side of the business because, again, just the nature of what they were doing had changed. There wasn't as much call. As you imagine, with the development of farming techniques and things like that, there was not the same level of need for the things they had traditionally made. And so they stopped focusing on that and instead focused on resistance welding, which, forgive me, I'm sure maybe Brian Aspinall or somebody else who has worked for the foundry might be able to help me with this. As far as I can understand, resistance welding is the heating of the join between two bits of metal. So you butt two pieces of metal together and you use a current to melt the join. If I am not correct in my welding definitions, somebody will amend it. So anyway, so they started to move towards that sort of thing, welding, resistance welding. We come now into World War II. Again, a hugely significant time for this company. The 1941 National Service Act, number 2, if you want to be precise, brought in the conscription of women. It's interesting to note that within 2 years of that act being passed, a third of all women, in fact, a third of all workers in factories were women, and Rose Street Foundry was no exception. It had 60 women trainees working in the foundry. There were a couple of things that they did, particularly during the Second World War, which gained huge commendation and notoriety. One was Pluto, some of you will be familiar with, which is the pipeline under the ocean. This, again, I know I'm using the word a lot, this is an extraordinary feat, but this really is quite amazing. The Rose Street Foundry Company were responsible for the machines which welded the pipeline under the oceans. That's what Pluto stands for, pipeline under the ocean. And this was a line that was sunk across the channel to pump fuel from England to the Allied forces on the front. This fueled the invasion of Normandy. Obviously, the danger, as they had seen in the First World War, when they had created the boom defences, the danger is the U-boats sinking the oil tankers. And so they had created instead a system that meant fuel could be pumped under the water to France to literally to fuel the Allied invasion. It is potentially true that just wouldn't have succeeded without the skill of the workers at Rose Street Foundry, and that's an absolutely extraordinary thing to think about. I'd like to read to you just a quote that dates from that time in the collection. It says, so this is people writing to the directors of the Rose Street Foundry. I enclose the sheet headed Operation Pluto, and I think the data in it will be of interest to you. Out of 198,800 welds, not one was found to be defective. That's extraordinary, I think. As well as the pipeline under the ocean, they were also involved in creating machines that welded Spitfire hubs and various other things. And again, all buildings were requisitioned during the Second World War because they were of such use to the government's war effort. After the war, well, during the war, actually, someone came up from the government to give them an official vote of thanks. Sir Stafford Cripps came to give an official thanks from the government to the Rose Street Foundry. And then after the war, they received 2 royal commendations for their work on the Spitfire hubs and on the pipeline under the ocean. It's just amazing when you think about the beginnings of the company that they went on to have that level of influence and impact on the progress of the war. Unlike the First World War, which was followed by a recession, the Second World War was followed by a boom time for Rose Street Foundry. They went on to making and supplying all sorts of welding machinery, and again to New Zealand, to China, to India, a global impact again. We've got some cracking photos from this time, and next time you're all able to come in, some kind of normal world, and you're able to come in and see us, I hope you can come in and have a look at some of those photos of the complete and utter lack of health and safety as people stand in front of a welding machine and the sparks fly into their eyes and they're just standing there watching it. For some of you maybe who work there, it will be not as surprising, but for those of us who have grown up in the health and safety area, it's an interesting set of photos. Moving into the 1950s and 60s, they diversified again. They started to develop new machinery. They developed wheel rim welding machines, and notably the rail welding machinery, which could weld together long pieces of track. And again, these were shipped all over the world. So they were used on the Canadian Pacific Railroad, they were used in New Zealand, America, all sorts of things. Sam Hunter Gordon passed away in 1959, and I'd like to just read to you a little bit from his obituary, because as I've said several times, he was so innovative in the way he ran the company, and that is specifically mentioned in his obituary. So it says here, he directed the affairs of the company with such superlative ability, energy and foresight that it became a firm with a worldwide reputation. Entrusted with big orders for specialist machinery, he kept the foundry going to the inestimable benefit of Inverness and of many families in the town. He was succeeded in the job by his son, Pat Hunter Gordon, who I know if any of you who worked there, you'll maybe remember him. Certainly when we've spoken in the past, had events to do with AI welders, people speak fondly of their memories of Pat Hunter Gordon and his wife Valerie, who was also in her own right a fascinating person, who invented the first ever disposable nappy. So there you go. 1962 sees the next name change for the company. So this is when they became known as AI Welders. And again, you could see how they're changing their name to represent what they do. So the word foundry is no longer as relevant for them, whereas the word welders is the key thing. One of my absolute favourite things from this collection dates from 1968. It's a cutting from the Highland News, and I'm going to read it to you because if I try and word it myself, I won't do it justice. So it's to do with the installation of computers, and it says, AI Welders Limited are to install an American-designed finance computer at their Academy Street Inverness offices tonight, the first of its type north of Glasgow. Costing £14,000, the computer, which was programmed and set up in Dundee to cope with accounting, arrives in Inverness at 6:30 p.m. tonight and will be hoisted the 30 feet up to the accounts department. No jobs will be lost as a result of this computer. I hope you all love that as much as I do. That is the image of it being hoisted 30 feet up, having been programmed to cope with accounting. But the fact remains that at the time, it's a huge cutting edge piece of technology, a piece of equipment, and it just shows that the state that the company was in, that they could afford to have that installed and use it. 1960s, 70s and 80s, as many of you will be familiar, was a hard time for many heavy industries. There was a recession, and there was a huge impact on AI welders, as there was for all other similar companies. There were enforced reduced hours, and a hard time to be in a heavy industry. But by the mid 80s, that had started to pick up again. There were a lot of big contracts won to the value of about £1.5 million, and so you can see the starting to come out of the hard time of the recession. And this is when they moved into friction welding. So moving away again from a different type of welding, always trying to stay at the forefront of how things are done and how to develop the company in a way that would keep people in jobs and keep them at the front of innovation. Patrick Hunter-Gordon died very tragically and unexpectedly in 1978. And that was the end of the connection with the Hunter-Gordons to the company. And Versen took over the company in 1985, creating Versen AI. It was 1988 that saw the sale of the famous Rose Street building on Academy Street. I say that Rose Street Foundry building on Academy Street. And that really is the end of an era when the company moved out of that base that they had been in for such a long time and moved onto the Longman industrial estate. In 1991, Versen stopped trading. There was a management buyout, and the AI Welders was re-established on a smaller scale out at Dalcross outside Inverness. But from the point of view of our collections, that's really where we start to see an end to the collection that we look after, and the closing down of the company AI Welders. I hope you'll agree it's an absolutely fascinating story of a company that has gone from such a small agricultural foundry making bits for ploughs to become a global leader in welding machinery, in the war effort in both world wars. It's a really, really interesting company. As I mentioned at the beginning, I would encourage you please to go and have a look at the Academy Street project website. That will give you more information about the work they've done to involving with the restoration of the building and the development of and changing face of Academy Street and redevelopment of that. So please do have a look at that. Particularly, they've created a digital trail, a heritage trail, which takes you through Academy Street, looking at different buildings, and has a section focusing on AI Welders building there. So please do have a look at that. If you've got any questions about the collection that we care for, as I say, it's a huge and fascinating collection of records. So if you have any questions about it, please just get in touch with us. I hope you can join us next week. I'm going to be looking at the church records. This is a collection of records that people always suspect might not be that interesting, and then as soon as they look at them, go, these are amazing. The church records are full of all sorts of stories. So I hope you can join me next week when I look at that, and then in the coming weeks when we're looking at court records and some of the other collections that we care for. Particularly of interest, I've noted the asylum records are getting a lot of interest. So I hope you can join us for the next ones as well, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you.